If you would, when you go to the podium, would you state your name and address for us, please, sir?
I think the switch is controlled over here where Martin is, or in the back where Kathleen is.
There you go.
Fantastic. Thanks. Thank you, Chair and fellow members. My name is Dan O'Mara with Dominium, and we are the owners of the property aforementioned. The our headquarters address, is 2905 Northwest Boulevard, and that is in Plymouth, Minnesota, 55441. And so this is a property that we currently own. Actually, we acquired this property. If that was at 92%, at 100%, you'd be at what, maybe 490-ish, somewhere in that count range. You know, if we're going by the numbers on the chart there. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Has staff calculated under the current requirement? My understanding that under the current requirement, 703 parking spaces would be required.
So if this project were to be permitted through the city, then it would have been required to have 703. If you recall through the discussion of the history, this project originally came through as a county permit, and then the city annexed it. So that's why the parking never met the requirements.
So as it stands now, this property lacks almost 140.
Maintenance shed. Right now, there's not enough maintenance on the property. So what's happening is the existing garage is actually being used for storage, but so we're using it right now for maintenance, which we should really not be using it for, and therefore that's why we're building the second one, so we can dedicate that one back to the residents that have physical handicap needs.
So the proposal is to decrease the total number of parking by 7 spots so that one additional garage can be provided on the property for residents.
And the bus shelter.
And the bus shelter. And the bus shelter, currently the bus stop is off of the property.
Correct. It's in the public right away right now. I think there's a picture of it up there. Yeah, there it is right there.
And the bus that services that bus stop, is that a private bus for this community only, or is it a public transportation system for the general public?
Our understanding, it's both, which is, I think, why they're here. First, to make sure that when they build that bus station, it's not in the city right away, or if it is, it's done so safely, I think, is the way that Mohammed's explaining it, and expanding that bus station, that bus depot, and improving it creates, we'll call it pedestrian hazards in light of the open ditch and how that expansion would affect it.
But the proposed bus covering that's going to be on the property, is the city going to somehow change or move the current and existing bus stop?
No, the apartment complex is another thing too, is we actually asked the bus service, the district, if they would come in from the, I can't remember what the north side is, the street coming in from that way. They would not do that. They pick up the kids right here at this location. And
our experience with the ISDs is that they don't like to go on private property, especially in apartment complexes, because if there is an accident, the liability isn't determined by the police department because it's on private property. Additionally, sometimes the buses have some difficulties turning. So, and again, this is coming from my experience as a prosecutor handling those things. People just, the fewer stops on Broadway, since it currently doesn't have an esplanade, the better for reducing traffic hazards. So being on the back side of the building instead of at
Everything else has to be brought up to code. Am I remembering that wrong? Have an existing nonconformity. In fact, maybe not in law, but in fact it is an existing nonconformity. And now we're going to change the existing nonconformity. And doesn't that require or trigger additional requirements to bring whatever the property was up to code in all other respects to eliminate that existing or prior nonconformity?
So there are a few different places where something like that does happen. There are triggers for UDC compliance to bring the site into compliance if it meets those trigger requirements. Planning staff has reviewed.
We can do this, or by doing this, it's because the character or use of the building makes unnecessary the full provision of parking or loading facilities as contrasted with merely granting an advantage or convenience. Is there something about the character of the property that makes the number of parking spaces unnecessary?
And I wasn't involved in the exact decision on this, but I would say that the maintenance building doesn't necessitate more parking. The bus station doesn't require more parking. So those are the things, that's the use of those buildings that, you know, you're not getting in it, but I'm sure that staff went through that whole analysis and picked every word apart, and I probably should have let them speak first.
Well, I mean, the entire property, the entire apartment complex. Is there something about the characteristic of the entire property that for this number of
in order to reduce the total amount of installed parking. Here, the site is constrained by I'm going to say that it's a lake, although I believe that it may have been a borrow pit that turned into a lake or something, but there's a pond that significantly reduces the area that you could install additional parking spaces on. So in order to bring full compliance, they would have to bring in full 100% plus 50 spaces. If we were to require that full 703, they'd have an additional 200 parking spaces that would just be potentially on their current use and scale would be unused area. So this is part of the reason why with the addition of what Lauren spoke to of the buildings not generating additional parking need, that we felt it was appropriate to recommend for this special exception.
If I may add to that, my understanding from the meeting that we had with the applicant is that this property also is affordable housing, and the applicant may be able to speak to that. Again, I'm not sure if affordable housing is associated with maybe lower car ownership, just like senior living and some other type of uses.
Income maximum of 60% of what the area median income is. And on average throughout our country, so we own close to 300 properties across the country. On average, our resident earns around $21,000 a year. So if you were to take that into account, there's a pretty high percentage that would not be able to afford multiple cars. At the same time, what I did was a quick calculation. We have, with all of our properties, we have a spreadsheet. We do tally parking counts on all of our properties. Our average is, and that includes 1, 2, and 3 bedroom. I don't know what that is right offhand on the top of my head, but per property, we average 1.7.
Favor, and nobody has shown up to speak tonight against it. There was one resident who lives on a residential street on the other side of Fight Road who suggested that because of loud noise on Fight Road, they are not in favor of this. And staff did reflect that in the staff report, saying there was one written complaint, and that was the one that was delivered to you. So.
Right. Thank you. We would like, okay. We'd like to move into consideration and possible action.
I make a motion to approve variance 22-0001 as presented.
It's been motioned. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been motioned and second. Any discussion? All in favor, raise your hand. All opposed, raise your hand. Motion carries 5-0. We'd like to move into our next required 7.5-foot setback in the Old Town Site Residential District. The general location is 2527 South Washington Avenue, Pearland, Texas. Staff report.
Thank you, Chair. Again, let me introduce Patrick. Patrick, take it away.
Thank you, Martin. As previously mentioned, the variance is for a reduced side setback for a proposed development in the Old Town Residential District from 7.5 to 5 feet on both sides of the property. General location, as you mentioned, was 2527 South Washington Avenue. The zoning of the district, as mentioned, was Old Town Residential, and the proposed use is duplexes. Staff sent notice of the request to all property owners within 200 feet, as well as posting it in the local newspaper. To date, we received one phone call that was against the request. As mentioned, the zoning of the property is Old Town Residential. Sorry, it's a little small, but surrounding it is all Old Town Residential on all sides. Additionally, the future land use of the property is Village District, which is meant for a mix of uses such as residential, commercial, retail, and all the properties surrounding the subject property are also Village District. The history of the property is annexed into the city in 1959. It's been a part of the Old Town site, and to date it has not been developed. So the surrounding uses on the property to the north and south are both residential uses. Across Washington Avenue is an undeveloped parcel. And then behind the property to the east is mostly undeveloped, but there's also portions, kind of like corners of the subject property, abut some residential properties. Here's a street view of the current property from Washington Avenue. As you can see, it's currently undeveloped. And we also get the view of the undeveloped parcels. We get the view of the adjacent property to the east that abuts on the rear, and then the view of the adjacent property to the west across Washington Avenue. And then we also get the two residential properties. The one to the north is more of a single family type, and then the one to the south is, I believe, a quadruplex. And here's the proposed site plan for the property. Currently, the current property is 4 Old Town site lots, and it's planned to break it up into 2 lots that are 50 feet by 125 feet. And then, as you can see, both of the duplexes on the properties would have a 5-foot setback as requested on the side of the lot. And then to the right is kind of just a general floor plan of what it might look like. It's not an exact, but it's just a general floor plan. And kind of looking at the criteria for approval of the variance, the variance only meets 4 of the 8 criteria for approval of a variance. And specifically in staff's analysis, if you go to the next slide, Martin, staff didn't find a physical hardship does not exist on the property. However, staff does want to note that similar sites have been rezoned to accommodate 5-foot side setbacks in the Old Town site. Specifically, across on the other side of 35, the Sullivan brothers, through that plan development, they are doing 5-foot side setbacks, which is within an Old Town site zoning. And then also just to note, if approved, the applicant will be required to still meet all the development regulations for the OTR, Old Town Residential District, as well as meeting any building, fire safety, and engineering requirements. So staff offers no objections to the variance approval. However, if approved by the board, staff recommends the following condition be attached: that the 5-foot side setback is only applicable if the property is platted in the configuration shown on the site plan as 50 feet by 125 feet, which is the 50 feet specifically is the minimum width that the OTR district can be without needing a plat variance to get approved. And that concludes staff's report.
Thank you. Is there an applicant presentation? If you would, please state your name and address.
Good evening. My name is Swapna Patel, and I reside at 2002 Wineberry, Katy, Texas, 77450. I am speaking on behalf of the investment group that is going to be developing this. They do reside in the city of Manville.
If you would, ma'am, go to the podium and state your name and address, and then you can begin.
We'll come back, we'll open a separate hearing for the next one, ma'am.
Well, that's what I'm saying, but, okay.
Yeah, so if you want to wait until the next one, if that's the one that you're more concerned about, that would be the appropriate time for you to speak.
My guess is, though, is that all in one did
I don't know the answer to that. Each application stands on its own merits, even if they are very similar.
Okay. Then I shall wait.
Okay, so we'd like to move into staff and applicant discussion.
I have a question. Does staff recommend that we approve the variance?
So based off of the criteria for that, we don't offer any objection if the board wishes to approve this. It's just that staff cannot say that we are recommending for it because there is no physical hardship.
I suppose my question's pretty direct. Does staff recommend that the ZBA board approve the proposal, or does staff recommend that we deny the proposal?
Staff is not recommending either approval or denial. We have no objection to it being approved.
Mr. Valle, if you don't mind me asking a different question that I think gets to staff's analysis, with a 25-foot lot, which is currently there, and I mean, if this doesn't go through and somebody wants to build on what's there now with the platted lots, it would have to be a building on a 25-foot lot with a 7.5-foot side setback on both sides.
Correct.
And that would be with
If you may, you can go ahead and continue.
No, go ahead. That's fine.
Yeah. So if you may allow me to just to explain one thing, the reason that we're not objecting to this request, and as we stated in the staff report in the presentation, is that the UDC, the Unified Development Code, actually does allow properties that have been platted prior to 2006 to reduce the side setback from 7.5 to 5 foot with the understanding that there have to be separation between buildings of 15 feet. We think that 15 feet comes from the building code, but the building code has changed in Pearland. And now it can allow, even lesser than 15 feet. So had this property been platted prior to 2006, and many properties in the Old Town side and many areas of the city may have been platted prior to 2006, which allows them to actually have only 5 foot.
And another one being brought tonight, requesting the identical variance. Moreover, during staff's presentation, I believe it was mentioned that there were other deviations from this same required setback. As a ZBA board, by engaging in a trend of approving various, especially almost identical variances, are we in effect, one, zoning as a ZBA board, and number two, inviting the various other lot owners in that area to flood the board with other similar, substantially similar requests for the same type of variance?
So, Lawrence, if I can take a stab at that beforehand. If you may recall, take us back of case back to the board to take that legislative action to create a way so that it's not bringing that same hardship or lack thereof to the board for approval. So, for those of you who have been on the board for many years, you'll notice we haven't had many porch variances brought forward since 2019 because we changed the rule on it. And now we're being allowed to handle those as a by right issue instead of needing to approach the board. So for a long time, the Old Town site has remained approvals or steps towards approval on.
Gary?
Did I miss here a while ago? I forgot who was speaking, but did we say that we had changed the UDC to allow now a 5-foot setback?
I was providing an example about how the board had heard multiple cases in a row of a similar issue. Part of Ms. Board member Devay's question was if we were taking actions with
For this number one, or for this thing, planning might say that we need to change the regulation, and an attorney might say, maybe I need to educate you better or remind you of what the criteria for approval is. There is a balance. How many of these, and I mean, there's not a set number, does 3 mean you've created a legislation through the ZBA? Does 5 out of 10? There's no percentage, but I completely understand your point. And I appreciate you bringing that up because that is absolutely something that the board needs to be cognizant of.
Any other?
I want to ask one more clarifying, or a couple of clarifying questions. If this were a commercial rental property or business of some kind, would that have changed the UDC requirement?
Can you repeat that?
If it was a commercial property, it only could be a residential property in the Old Town residential zoning district.
Because that's
So if it was a residential property being used as a rental property, some people would consider that to be commercial, but it's still residential in nature, and the same regulation would apply.
I Normally, I'm used to seeing all sorts of landscaping requirements change whenever we get these variances on a setback. I didn't see a single reference to landscaping requirements, not a desire to develop Old Town, or do we have a process or a program of any kind that cities come up with where we're trying to get more development in that area? Or is that just happenstance?
I would say that the comprehensive plan, over the years has, been a champion to encourage development and reuse and redevelopment of sites within the Old Town District. I believe there was an Old Town study. I want to say it was in 2008, which recommended some changes that were then adopted into the Unified Development Code, which set out and established the Old Town Residential, Old Town Mixed Use, and Old Town General Business Districts. With that said, the point of
I know you're not recommending, or you're not recommending, but
development of a residential product within Old Town Residential meets the criteria of the future land use plan for this zoning district. I can say that confidently.
Okay. That gives me a direction. Thank you.
And I just want to make sure that I'm circling back as far as what we're required to do as a board and what we can consider as a board, because I think there's been some additional discussion. As a board tonight, we can only consider this particular variance presented to us. The fact that it fails to meet the 8 criteria that we're supposed to consider, and that the staff is not in a position to recommend approval. Is that fair?
That's fair, but I would say that what you should do is, if you look at the criteria for approval, the table that you had with the green, the red and the green.
For the site plan, I mean, are you intending to keep 4 lots or is it, I'm confused with that lot line in the middle of the building and not having a 5-foot setback.
Ms. Patel, I think that's a question directly for you if you'd step back up to the podium.
Per the requirements, it does need to be platted to be a 50 by 125 lot. Therefore, we did not replat it yet based on what the result of this meeting would be. But if this gets approved, we would be plotting it as 50 by 125.
Thank you, ma'am.
So the site plan is not a condition. Staff is recommending, if you were to consider approving this, that you are sure to, I think the staff recommendation worded it to make sure that there are 2 lots that are 50 by 125. So another way to say that is,
as well as the view of the adjacent property to the south is also a residence. Proposed site plan is also to be broken down into 2 lots that will be 50 feet by 125 feet, and it'll have a duplex on each with a total of 4 units. And then the proposed setback is shown on the sides of the property as being 5 feet. And then the the general floor plan for the property is also shown on the right. Looking at the criteria for approval of the variance, staff found that the variance request met 4 of the 8 criteria for approval. And the staff's analysis based on that criteria is that there is no physical hardship on the property. However, similar sites have been rezoned to accommodate 5-foot side setbacks within the Old Town site. If approved, the applicant will still be required to meet all other development regulations in the Old Town residential, such as their parking, their driveway, and their landscaping. And they also have to meet building, fire safety, and engineering requirements. Staff offers no objections to the variance's approval. If approved by the board, staff recommends the following condition be attached. 5-foot side setback is only applicable if the property is platted in the configuration shown on the site plan, which is 50 feet by 125 feet lots. That concludes staff's report.
Thank you. Is there applicant presentation?
Thank you. The only thing I'd like to add from earlier is, again, there is not a physical hardship, but there is nothing else that can be built on this land. We've done detailed discussions with staff. There are no other options that we were able to find, and we've done extensive studies to find things that will meet fire code, building code, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. Is there any persons wishing to?
Excuse me. So to me, that's quite an important one, particularly if you're a resident of where this proposal is about to be approved. So the criteria says, I guess financial gain shouldn't be at the crux of it. And sorry, I'm going to go through this as well. I went through the website, and I believe to the staff, the documents you guys put up there.
Excuse me, ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know this is your first time.
Yep.
So this is my fault of not telling you that you have 3 minutes. So I'm going to grant you 1 more minute so you can tie up what you need to tie up, because that was my mistake of not telling you that you have 3 minutes, okay?
Right. So I don't think financial return should be the primary driver of how you invest in a residence. And I would also argue the fact that literally just across the street, whenever they get a higher yield return on their investment. And I don't necessarily think that's the best thing for Ms. Tyndall, who sits here, who's on the property literally right beside. I'm on the property right across. I also take exception to the fact that, they talk about the neighborhood as being dilapidated. I don't think we live in a shanty town. I mean, I find it somewhat offensive. So I don't know if it's really great, character or taste or whatever, to come in and start saying that, these people live in just dilapidated buildings, and we're here to squeeze as much development on a 100-foot wide piece of property that we can.
Thank you,
And I
ma'am.
would suggest, so I'm going to finish.
Well, thank you, ma'am. I gave you additional minute and a half, so I've tried not to stop you.
Approval or denial, but we have no objection to the board approving this variance.
Does staff feel that because the proposal fails to meet 4 of the 8 criteria, it is unable to recommend approval to the CBA board?
Staff feels that because there is no physical hardship, and the physical hardship is often the key to the beginning of granting a variance, that is one of the primary reasons why we are not able to recommend approval.
May I see the 8 criteria, please? Does staff feel that this proposal on Texas Avenue meets criteria 1, 2, 3, and 6?
No, as highlighted, staff's
Feet from the edge of our property. So that's what we're asking for, is a change, and we could ask as much as 50%, which would get us to about 3.75 feet from our property line, being able to build as close as that. We are asking to build just 5 feet, which is 2.5 feet wider, so that we can actually build a duplex properly, so that you can get enough space.
So,
So there would need to be the same space on both sides of the property line. So it would be, as long as they're maintaining 5 feet, just as we are, we would be 10 feet in between. Yes, sir.
thank you. So staff, with this project of someone's home, because where I live is you have to be 10 feet from your neighbor. Are we asking for a reduction of that on the side?
You would have a minimum of 12.5 feet. 5 feet, if you granted this one, 5 feet from the zone change regulation would be to reduce the 7.5 feet to a 5-foot side separation.
I have a question or just confirmation. Staff mentioned that the 5-foot side setback has been granted in other lots within this area. Is that correct?
So our discussion was that in the Sullivan plan development, that they had requested a side setback of 3 foot. They in turn have discussed raising that to a 5 foot, and that is what they plan on building with.
Mr.
Ma'am,
Costa,
I'm sorry, we're past that section.
to answer your question differently, a variance wasn't granted for the Sullivan project. What happened was it was rezoned. So instead of being Old Town residential, it's stating that with their recommendation. And I don't want to simplify that, but that's my understanding. That's the point. Is that
It's a portion of our point.
Thank you.
There are, from the map, it appears that there are residents who live on each side of this proposed property. Have the residents on either side approved or notified the staff that they approve of this variance?
So our standard procedure is to send notification to everyone within 200 feet for each case that is brought forward. According to what we have on the slide here, we only had the one phone call against. There may be, I don't remember which case it was that we had a printout for that was offered to y'all.
staff be aware of this issue? It is the written objections or the comments from the podium that carry the weight. Because at the end of the day, we don't know who the phone person is. I have no problem telling you. It's my understanding that the neighbor immediately to the north is here tonight. And before the meeting, I overheard some of the neighbor immediately to the north, some of that conversation. But that neighbor has chosen to not speak tonight.
And may I ask questions of the lady who was speaking earlier that's in the blue?
Miss Wendy Farrell, I think it is.
Farrell?
Ms. Farrell? Yes, ma'am. It's in the, I'm trying to think of how to describe that. It's ultimately in the chair's discretion whether or not to allow somebody new to the podium, but you could always ask the chair, I'm sorry, somebody who's spoken to clarify. It's always within the chair's discretion to get an answer to your question. I think this is raised,
This proposal, she wants to decline it. Just those two things.
yeah, and that would be in the chair's discretion. I can answer one of those questions for you, and
I'd
I can
like that.
speculate as to the other one. Okay. So she is directly across the street from this proposal. If you go at this lot and go across the street, I believe it is the bottom half, because I guess those lots have been platted. Yeah, where the word residential is.
Right.
That is where Miss Farrell's home is, because she identified her property address at the beginning. And I could speculate it and characterize how I think she feels about this, but I would rather not speculate.
Ms. Carroll, would you state your against or opposed? Ma'am. All in, is there,
Sorry, Mr. Shrum, I did not hear that. Were you including the staff recommendation or the staff condition in your motion?
Yes, and I realized I saw in the write-up of that, of the staff recommendation on that.
Thank you. I do appreciate it. I heard the chair ask that question, but I didn't hear your response.
it's been motion, is there a second? It's been motion and second. Any discussion? All in favor, raise your hand. All opposed, raise your hand.
From our outdoor mall to community events and everything in between, the sense of safety is evident because of the dedication we feel to protect our community. I'm Pearland Police Chief Johnny Spires. The Pearland Police Department has started the process of recruiting the next group of officers that will have the opportunity to serve our great community. I would like to invite you to make a difference by joining our great team. The Pearland Police Department understands